Invisibility wasn't a magical gift. It was a curse, a thick layer of grime and exhaustion that clung to Ilara's very soul. At 24, her existence was measured in the sticky rings left by ale mugs on wooden tables and the ghost of conversations that floated past her, never directed at her. She was a phantom in her own life, a silent cog in the loud, heaving machinery of the border town tavern. The weight of her parents' debts was a physical ache in her shoulders, a constant pressure behind her eyes that made the flickering candlelight blur into a hazy, hopeless smear. Her dreams had long ago been ground into the dust kicked up by travelers' boots, leaving only the raw, gnawing desire to be seen, to be acknowledged as more than just a pair of hands that refilled a cup. As she stood there, a brief pause in an endless night. Let us see you. Take a moment to comment your name, where you're watching from, and the time of day it is in your world. And please, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment of this journey. The tavern itself was her gilded cage, its walls saturated with the scent of stale wine and broken promises. Each coin that landed on her tray was not her own. It was a small offering to the mountain of debt left by her parents, a ledger kept with cruel precision by the tavern's owner. A man whose eyes lingered on her with a proprietary hunger that made her skin crawl. Her life was a cruel equation of endless work yielding zero progress, a loop of servitude from which there was no escape. She served brash merchants and weary soldiers, men who saw her as part of the furniture, their casual cruelty and dismissive glances reinforcing the narrative that she was utterly insignificant. The heavy wooden door was not a gateway to the world, but a seal on her tomb, locking her into a present as bleak and unchanging as the greasy film on the windows. A future she was too terrified to even contemplate. In the stolen moments of quiet, in the cold solitude of her small attic room, Ilara allowed herself to be more than a waitress. Here, away from the noise and the judgment, she would trace the lines on her palm, wondering if a different fate had ever been written there. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard was her only treasure, a small, smooth river stone, worn to a perfect grey sheen. It was a remnant of a day long past, a trip to the river with her mother before the debts and the despair had consumed them. Holding it, she would close her eyes and dream not of castles or jewels, but of a simple life, a small cottage where the air smelled of bread instead of beer, a place where someone would look at her and see not a burden or an opportunity, but simply her. This hidden well of softness was her most dangerous secret, a vulnerability she guarded fiercely in a world that had taught her tenderness was a fatal flaw. The town itself existed on a precipice, pressed against the shimmering, ethereal curtain known as the Veil. It was a constant, silent presence on the horizon, a beautiful and terrifying boundary between the human world of grit and struggle and the elven realm of Silverwood, a place of myth and magic. Locals spoke of the elves in hushed, resentful tones, immortal, arrogant beings who lived in ageless forests and looked down upon the short, chaotic lives of humans. The veil was a symbol of a fragile peace, a wound from an ancient war that had never truly healed. For Ilara, it was the ultimate barrier, a shimmering testament to the vast, insurmountable distance between her life of dirt and desperation and a world of impossible grace. It reinforced her place, reminding her that she was on the wrong side of a cosmic divide, a creature of earth forever looking at a sky she could never touch. The night's rhythm was suddenly shattered. It wasn't the familiar sound of a bar fight or the heavy clang of the town guard's patrol. It was a sharp, crystalline crack that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air, followed by a child's cry, thin, terrified, and distinctly inhuman. The sound sliced through the tavern's drunken din, a needle of pure silver in a tapestry of coarse wool. Every instinct screamed at Ilara to ignore it, to bolt her door and pretend she'd heard nothing. The alley behind the tavern was a place of shadows and forgotten things, no place for a lone woman after dark. But the cry came again, laced with a pain that resonated with the forgotten child inside her. A strange, magnetic pull drew her towards the back door, a sense that the world had just tilted on its axis. Her hand trembled as it reached for the latch, a single choice about to unravel her entire existence. The alley's damp chill clung to her thin clothes as Ilara knelt, the world narrowing to the small, whimpering form before her. It was a child, no older than 5, but his features were impossibly fine-boned, his ears tapering to delicate points that peeked through a cascade of silver hair. A deep gash on his leg bled a substance that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Like liquid starlight, ignoring the alien quality of it, Ilara saw only a frightened child, far from home. She tore a strip from her apron, her hands moving with an instinct born of forgotten tenderness. The lullaby that escaped her lips was a ghost, a melody her own mother used to sing before the sickness and the debts had stolen her voice. A fragile tune about a star finding its way back to the sky. It was a small, foolish act of comfort in a world that had offered her none. Her past was a landscape of ghosts and ledgers. Her parents had been weavers of dreams, their heads full of stories, and their hands quick to spend coin they didn't have on ventures that always soured. They promised her a life painted in bright colors, but left her with a canvas stained in the drab grey of their failures. Their death was not a sudden, tragic event, but a slow, quiet surrender to despair, leaving Ilara shackled to their legacy of debt. The tavern owner had taken her in, not out of kindness, but as collateral. Every tankard she filled, every table she wiped, was a penance for a sin she did not commit. She was paying for their optimism, for their inability to face the harsh reality that now defined her every waking moment. A debt of coin that had become a debt of the soul. This inherited burden was the source of her deepest wound. A profound, crushing invisibility. To the patrons of the tavern, she was less than a person. She was a function, a pair of hands that brought ale and took away empty plates. Their eyes slid over her, their conversations flowed around her as if she were a rock in a stream. This constant, casual dismissal had carved a hollow space inside her, a conviction that she was fundamentally unworthy of notice. She learned to move silently, to anticipate needs without being asked, to make her presence as minimal as possible. The contempt was rarely overt. It was in the lack of a thank you, the coin tossed onto the table instead of placed in her hand, the collective amnesia of her existence. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's lives. Because of this, the very idea of romance was a cruel fantasy, a story meant for other girls in other worlds. Love, she believed, was predicated on being seen, truly and wholly, by another person. How could anyone fall in love with a shadow? How could a heart that had been taught to beat quietly so as not to disturb anyone ever learn to beat for someone else? The men who frequented the tavern saw her as an object, a convenience, or not at all. The thought of a gentle touch, of a shared secret in the dark, felt like a language from a foreign land. Survival was her only suitor, a demanding and jealous partner that left no room for dreams of affection. Her heart was a fortress she had built not to keep others out, but to protect herself from the painful truth that no one was even trying to get in. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the alley, solidifying into a figure of terrifying stillness and power. He was tall, impossibly so, clad in armor that seemed to drink the moonlight, his face a mask of cold, regal fury. The air grew heavy, charged with an ancient, palpable authority that made the breath catch in Ilara's throat. It was his eyes, however, that held her captive, the color of a winter sky. They were not merely looking at her, but through her, assessing every fiber of her being with an intensity that was both invasive and shattering. In that moment, she was seen more completely than she had ever been in her life, and it was terrifying. He didn't move towards his son, but his gaze fell upon her hands, her torn apron, and the soft, trembling notes of her forgotten lullaby, his expression unreadable. He moved with a speed that was not human, a silent, fluid grace that closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. Ilara flinched back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream, but no threat came. The tall elf simply knelt, his movements precise and economical, and gathered the small, injured child into his arms. The boy whimpered, burying his face in the man's shoulder. The king, for he could be nothing less, rose to his full, intimidating height, his silver eyes finally locking onto hers. There was no gratitude in them, nor was there the anger she expected. There was only a cold, unyielding resolve. "You will come with me," he stated, his voice a low, resonant command that was not a request. It was a declaration of fact, a shift in the fundamental laws of her universe. Before she could process the words, his guard materialized from the shadows, their presence as sudden and silent as his own. The world dissolved into a dizzying swirl of shimmering light and disorienting sensation. The familiar, grimy scent of the alley was ripped away, replaced by the crisp, clean fragrance of ancient trees and night-blooming flowers. The air itself tasted of ozone and starlight. When reality solidified again, it was to a scene of breathtaking, impossible grandeur. She stood in a vast hall of white marble and polished silver, under a ceiling that seemed to hold the night sky captive, with constellations wheeling slowly overhead. The cold of the floor seeped through her worn shoes, a stark reminder of her own insignificance in this place of ethereal beauty. The elven king stood before her on a raised dais, his injured son now gone, his expression as remote and unyielding as a mountain peak. She was a stray animal dragged into a palace, utterly lost and waiting for a judgment she couldn't begin to comprehend. King Theron was not merely a man. He was a living monument, carved from ancient stone and winter frost. His silver hair, a stark contrast to the dark, polished obsidian of his armor, fell like a waterfall over shoulders that carried the weight of a dying kingdom. His face was a study in severe, ageless beauty, with high cheekbones and a jawline that could have been cut from a diamond. But it was his eyes that held the true measure of his power. They were the color of a storm-tossed sea, deep and cold, holding the wisdom of centuries and the weariness of a king watching his world unravel. The very air around him seemed to grow thin and sharp, charged with an authority so absolute it was a physical pressure against Ilara's skin. He didn't need to raise his voice. His stillness was a command, his gaze a judgment that stripped away all pretense, leaving her feeling as fragile and insignificant as a dried leaf in a gale. This formidable exterior was a carefully constructed fortress, built to conceal a kingdom rotting from within. The Silverwood realm was afflicted by a creeping magical blight they called the Fading. It was a slow, silent poison that leached the color from the leaves, quieted the ancient songs of the streams, and most terrifyingly had rendered his people sterile. An entire generation of elves had passed without a single new birth, their immortality becoming a curse as they watched their future wither on the vine. His own son, Lyran, was a miracle and a tragedy, one of the last children, a constant, fragile reminder of their impending extinction. The political pressure from his council was a relentless tide of hushed whispers and desperate, accusing glances. They demanded a solution, a cure, a miracle, while rival houses watched his every move, sensing weakness and circling like vultures, awaiting the final fall of a great beast. Beneath the crown and the armor was a solitude so profound it was its own form of blight. Theron was a ruler with absolute power over a realm he was powerless to save, a father who could command armies but could not protect his own son from the creeping doom that threatened them all. In the long, silent nights, he would stand before the portraits of his ancestors, their serene, powerful faces a silent condemnation of his failure. The fear for Lyran was a constant, cold knot in his chest. The boy was not just his son. He was the last flicker of a dying flame, the repository of all his hopes and terrors. This hidden vulnerability was a chasm within him, a secret weakness that made his cold, authoritative mask not just a political tool, but a vital piece of personal armor against a despair that threatened to consume him entirely. It was this desperation that forced him to reconsider the whispers of an old, half-forgotten prophecy, one that spoke of a union between fading silver and vibrant earth as the only hope for renewal. For centuries, he had dismissed it as folklore, a fanciful tale for children. But seeing Ilara in that filthy human alley, her hands gentle on his injured son, her voice a soft, human lullaby that had soothed the boy's elven terror, it was as if the prophecy had taken living, breathing form before his eyes. She was the vibrant earth in its purest state, resilient, compassionate, and so fiercely alive, despite her squalor. The logic of a 1,000-year-old monarch screamed that it was impossible, that a short-lived human could not be their salvation. But the terrified father in him saw a flicker of impossible hope, a dangerous, irrational spark he was desperate enough to chase. His decision to bring her across the veil had not been an act of random cruelty, but one of calculated, brutal necessity. The moment Lyran slipped through the veil, he exposed the kingdom's two most devastating secrets. The air was vulnerable, and the fading was so advanced that even the royal bloodline was not immune to physical injury in the outside world. Had any of Theron's political rivals discovered this, it would have been proof of his weakening hold, an invitation for a coup that would plunge the Silverwood into civil war and seal its doom. He had to contain the situation, and that meant containing the one witness. Ilara was a loose thread that could unravel everything. In his cold, strategic mind, bringing her here was the only option, a necessary sacrifice to protect the future of his entire race. Her fear was regrettable, but in the grand, terrible calculus of his rule, it was insignificant. Standing on the dais, the weight of his decision settled upon him. The vast, silent hall seemed to hold its breath, the starlight from the enchanted ceiling casting long, lonely shadows across the marble floor. He had observed her from afar, seen the raw terror in her eyes as she took in the impossible grandeur of his world, a world he was now forced to entangle with hers. There was no more time for deliberation. The council was growing restless. The blight was spreading, and his son's reckless journey had forced his hand. His gaze, cold and resolute, found one of his royal guards standing motionless by the towering silver doors. The command left his lips, sharp and clear, echoing in the cavernous space with the finality of a death sentence. "Bring the human to me, now." He would make her his queen, or she would be the last mistake he ever made. Ilara was forced to her knees on the cold marble floor, a deliberate act of humiliation that made her feel smaller than she already was. The vast throne room was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. King Theron descended from his dais, his movements a slow, deliberate predator's stalk. He did not stop in front of her, but circled, his polished obsidian armor reflecting the starlight from the enchanted ceiling in distorted, menacing patterns. The air crackled with his power, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. He finally came to a halt directly before her, his shadow engulfing her completely. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the immense space, a low, resonant timbre that vibrated through the stone and into her bones. "Look at me, human." It was a command that stripped away her will, forcing her to lift her gaze to meet the glacial storm in his eyes. He began to speak, not of her crime or her fate, but of his own. His words were clipped, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a historical text rather than confessing the doom of his people. He spoke of the fading, a creeping blight that was not just a sickness of the land, but a curse upon their very essence. It leached the magic from their world, leaving their ancient forests brittle and grey, silencing the rivers, and slowly, inexorably, stealing their future. He explained that for over a century, not a single elven child had been born, their immortality transformed from a gift into a slow, agonizing march toward extinction. He was a king presiding over a magnificent, gilded tomb, his power absolute over a realm that was turning to dust in his hands. The confession was a glimpse into the chasm of his despair, yet his face remained an unreadable mask of stone. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, the only sign of the unbearable weight of his next words. He revealed that his son, Lyran, was a miracle, one of the last of his kind, a fragile vessel containing the final hopes of an entire race. Lyran's reckless journey through the Vale was more than a childish transgression. It was a catastrophic political disaster. By being injured in the human world, the boy had exposed the terrifying truth that the royal bloodline itself was not immune to the fading's weakening effects. Theron explained with chilling clarity that if his rivals on the council were to learn of this, they would see it as proof of his failing power, a weakness to be exploited. A civil war would tear their dying kingdom apart. "You," he stated, his eyes pinning her to the floor, "are the sole witness to a secret that could destroy us all. Your existence is now a threat I must contain." It was then that he spoke of the prophecy. He recited the ancient words with a tone of weary disdain, as if he were a scholar forced to consult a book of fairy tales in a desperate search for a cure. "When silver fades and the forests weep, hope shall be born of a union between fading silver and vibrant earth." For centuries, he had dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. But then he described what he had seen in the alley, not a dirty human servant, but a fierce, inexplicable compassion. He spoke of her soft lullaby soothing his son's elven terror, of her gentle hands cleaning a wound without hesitation. In that moment, he confessed, the impossible words of the prophecy had taken root in his mind. She, in her squalor and her resilience, was the vibrant earth, a spark of life in a world of decay. It was an irrational, desperate gamble, and his expression made it clear he hated himself for even considering it. With the cold finality of a judge passing sentence, he laid out his proposition. It was not a request, it was a decree. He offered her a pact, a contract forged of mutual desperation. She would become his wife, his queen, the royal consort of Silverwood. It would be a marriage in name only, a political performance designed for a single purpose, to present a facade of unity and hope to his restless court and to the dying kingdom. Her role would be to stand beside him, a living symbol of the prophecy fulfilled, a human bride to quell the whispers of his weakness and buy him the time he so desperately needed to find a real solution to the fading. There was no pretense of affection, no hint of romance. It was a transaction, a cold and calculated move in a deadly political game where she was to be the most important pawn on the board. In exchange for her life and her freedom, he offered her the world, the mountain of debt that had defined her existence, that had shackled her to the tavern, and its greasy, leering owner would be erased. He spoke of a sum of gold so vast it was meaningless to her, enough to buy the entire town she came from 10 times over. He offered her silks instead of rags, a palace instead of an attic room, security and power beyond the wildest imaginings of any human. He was offering to sever the chains of her past completely, to lift her from the grime and invisibility of her former life and place her on a throne. He would give her everything she could ever want, except the one thing she would have to sacrifice to get it: herself. The offer hung in the air between them, a golden, poisoned chalice. A storm of emotions raged within Elara, so violent it left her breathless. Fear warred with a dizzying, terrifying hope. A queen, her, the invisible tavern girl, a queen of these impossible, magical beings. The idea was so ludicrous it bordered on madness. She thought of her life, a monotonous cycle of servitude and exhaustion, of being looked through and passed over. She thought of the tavern owner's clammy hands and the crushing weight of a debt that would follow her to her grave. This king, this cold, terrifying monarchy, was offering her an escape. It was a gilded cage, yes, but her current life was a cage of filth and despair. Here, at least, she would be seen. The irony was savage. To finally be seen, she would have to become a lie, a symbol, a political tool. The choice was between two prisons, but one of them had a throne. Slowly, unsteadily, Elara pushed herself up from her knees, an act of defiance that seemed to surprise him. She met his icy gaze, her own eyes for the first time, holding not just terror, but a flicker of the resilience he had witnessed in the alley. Her voice was a mere whisper, yet it echoed with newfound strength in the cavernous hall. "I accept your proposal," she said, the words tasting like ash and metal on her tongue. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed his features before the mask of cold authority snapped back into place. He began to turn away. The matter settled. But she spoke again, her voice clearer now and sharper. "On one condition." He froze, turning back to face her, his expression a thundercloud of disbelief. "My life is yours to command," she stated, "but your son is not a pawn. He will not be used to manipulate me or as a weapon between us. He is a child, not a political asset. That is my price." The ceremony was not held in the grand throne room, but in a smaller, more ancient chamber deep within the palace. The walls were carved from living wood that twisted into patterns of roots and branches, and the only light came from glowing crystals embedded in the ceiling, casting a cold, blue-white luminescence over everything. Elara stood on a dais of polished obsidian, clad in silks, the color of twilight, that felt alien and heavy against her skin. They were a costume for a role she didn't know how to play. She could feel the collective weight of the elven court's gaze upon her. 100 pairs of ancient, almond-shaped eyes dissecting her with silent, chilling judgment. They saw not a queen, but a human blight, a necessary contamination. She focused on the simple act of breathing, trying to anchor herself in the terrifying, shimmering reality of the moment. Theron entered the chamber, not with the fanfare of a groom, but with the grim finality of a general committing to a desperate battle strategy. He wore formal robes of midnight blue and silver, the severe cut emphasizing the formidable breadth of his shoulders and his unnerving height. He did not look at her. His gaze swept over the assembled council members, a silent command for obedience, his face a mask of regal indifference that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath. To Elara, he looked less like a king and more like a magnificent caged storm, his power contained by sheer force of will. He was a monument to duty, and she was the latest, most humiliating inscription carved upon his surface. He took his place beside her on the dais, the space between them crackling with a cold, unspoken tension that was more intimate than any touch. An ancient elf with eyes like chips of ice stepped forward, his voice a low, melodic chant that filled the silent chamber. He spoke in the elven tongue, the words flowing like a river over smooth stones, ancient and incomprehensible to Elara. She didn't need to understand the language to feel the meaning. This was no celebration of love, it was a binding. With every resonant syllable, she felt a palpable shift in the air, a heavy, magical pressure that seemed to weave itself around them, pulling threads of fate and power together. It was a cold, inexorable process, sealing her into this world, into this life, with a magical finality that was far more terrifying than any human contract. She was being remade, her identity as a tavern girl dissolving into the new, terrifying shape of a political necessity. From the corner of her eye, Elara could see the faces of the council, a gallery of elegant, disdainful masks. One elf in particular, a noble with sharp features and a cruel twist to his lips, made no effort to hide his contempt. His eyes raked over her, from the worn leather of her old shoes, peeking from beneath the silk hem, to the human flush on her cheeks. He saw her as a symptom of the kingdom's decay, a vulgar bargain made by a weakened king. His scorn was a physical thing, a wave of palpable animosity that washed over her, and she knew it was a mirror for the entire court's sentiment. She was an outsider, an impurity, a short-lived creature of dirt and desperation brought in to save beings who believed themselves to be her divine superiors. Her presence was not a hope, it was a humiliation. The moment came for the vows. The ancient priest fell silent, turning his icy gaze upon them. Theron spoke first, his voice a low, clear command that resonated through the stone. He did not speak of love or devotion, but of alliance and protection. He pledged to honor the pact, to provide for her and shield her from his enemies. His words a carefully crafted political statement for the benefit of the watching council. When it was her turn, Elara's voice was a whisper, yet it did not tremble. She repeated the words she had been taught, pledging her loyalty to the Silverwood and its king, promising to be the symbol he required. The words felt like stones in her mouth, a necessary lie spoken to purchase her life, a performance that sealed the door on everything she had ever been. As the final vow was spoken, the ancient rite demanded they join hands. Theron turned to her, his movements economical and precise. He raised his hand, and after a heart-stopping pause, she placed her own in his. His skin was cool, smooth as river stone, his grip firm and utterly impersonal, a king accepting a fealty oath. For Elara, however, the contact was a cataclysm. It was the first time a man had touched her with purpose and without threat in a lifetime. The sheer, solid reality of him, the strength in his long fingers, the controlled power thrumming just beneath the surface, sent a jolt through her entire body. It was a simple gesture that shattered the abstract nature of their bargain, making it terrifyingly, irrevocably real. In that touch, she was no longer a pawn in a game. She was a woman bound to a dangerous, unknowable man. Theron had anticipated the gesture as nothing more than a necessary piece of theatre. He had steeled himself to feel nothing, to treat her hand as he would the hilt of a ceremonial sword. Yet the reality of her touch was a profound and unwelcome shock. The warmth of her skin was a startling contrast to the ambient chill of the chamber and the coldness of his own people. He could feel the faint, rapid, frantic pulse in her wrist, a vibrant, mortal rhythm so alien to his own slow, immortal existence. It was the beat of a life that burned brightly and quickly, a life of vibrant earth. The sensation was a breach in his defenses, a flicker of warmth against his frozen resolve. It was a dangerous, distracting detail that threatened the cold clarity his desperate plan required. The priest's voice intoned the final word of the binding rite, and the chamber held its collective breath. The ritual and the political performance demanded a final seal, a kiss to publicly affirm the union. Elara's blood ran cold. This was the ultimate act of the charade, a gesture of intimacy in a room devoid of it. She could feel the weight of every critical gaze, every noble waiting to see how their king would handle this final, distasteful duty. Bracing herself for a cold, brief, passionless press of lips, she lifted her chin, a small act of defiance. She would not flinch. She had traded her life for this role, and she would play it to the end, even if it shattered the last fragile pieces of herself. She would meet the ice of his kiss with the fire of her own resolve. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, his shadow engulfing her as he leaned in. The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of cold air and ancient pine that clung to him, the silver light glinting in his hair. His lips met hers, and at first they were just as she had expected, cool, firm and detached, a king sealing a treaty. But then, for the briefest fraction of a second, the performance faltered. A sudden, inexplicable flicker of heat bloomed between them. His lips softened almost imperceptibly against hers, and his hand, still holding her own, tightened its grip with a spark of possessive strength that was anything but ceremonial. It was a ghost of a sensation, a fleeting, involuntary confession that shattered the cold illusion of their pact. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. Theron drew back, his face once more a perfect, unreadable mask of glacial control, his winter sky eyes revealing nothing. The court had seen only the fulfillment of a rite, the sealing of a distasteful but necessary alliance, but Ilara knew what she had felt. She had seen the brief, unguarded flare of something wild and startled in his gaze before it was ruthlessly extinguished. In that single, stolen moment, the entire nature of their arrangement had been fractured. The cold, political contract had been irrevocably compromised, not by words or deeds, but by a single, uncontrollable spark of heat. It was a silent promise that the fire between them would not be contained by duty or decorum. A dangerous blaze that now threatened to consume them both. The days that followed the ceremony settled into a strange and silent rhythm, a new kind of servitude in a far more beautiful prison. Ilara learned the hushed footfalls of the palace guards, the way the light from the enchanted ceiling shifted with the hours, and the names of constellations she'd never known existed. She spent her time in the vast, silent library, surrounded by the scent of ancient paper and preserved wood, trying to decipher the history of a people who saw her as a temporary cure for a terminal disease. Theron was a constant, distant presence, a shadow in the corner of her eye. She would feel his gaze on her from a high balcony as she walked in the gardens, or sense his stillness in the doorway of the library before he would turn and leave without a word. Their cohabitation was a dance of avoidance, a shared space filled with the deafening sound of things left unsaid. One evening, while struggling with a dense tome on elven lineage, a wave of homesickness and frustration washed over her so powerfully it brought tears to her eyes. The intricate script blurred into meaningless squiggles, another reminder of how alien this world was, how utterly she did not belong. A shadow fell over the page. Theron stood beside her, his expression unreadable. Instead of the cold dismissal she expected, he reached out, his long, elegant finger tracing a line of text. "This script is ceremonial," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "It speaks of the Star Weavers, my mother's lineage." For a fleeting moment, the king was gone, and in his place was a man sharing a sliver of his past. He explained the passage with a patience that stunned her, the brief, shared lesson creating a fragile bridge across the chasm of silence that separated their two worlds. This fragile peace, however, did not extend beyond their private moments. In the formal council meetings she was now required to attend, Ilara was not a queen, but an exhibit. The nobles, led by a sharp-featured, ambitious lord named Valerius, treated her with a polite, venomous disdain that was far crueler than the tavern patron's open contempt. They spoke around her in flowing, rapid Elvish, their occasional glances in her direction, accompanied by thin, condescending smiles. Valerius, in a speech supposedly about the allocation of resources, made a pointed remark about the folly of investing in temporary solutions and foreign remedies, his eyes fixed on her. Each word was a carefully polished stone thrown at her, designed to remind her of her otherness, her inferiority, and the temporary, disposable nature of her role in their world. Theron listened to Valerius's thinly veiled insults with an unnerving stillness, his hands resting calmly on the arms of his throne. He let the silence stretch after the lord had finished, a cold, heavy pressure that made every noble in the room shift uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his voice was deceptively mild. "Lord Valerius," he began, his winter sky eyes pinning the noble in place, "your concern for the kingdom's resources is noted. Perhaps we should begin our review with an audit of your family's trade holdings along the border. I trust a house so concerned with foreign influence would have nothing to hide." The threat was unspoken, but perfectly clear. A muscle feathered in Valerius's jaw, and he bowed his head in stiff, resentful submission. Theron had not defended Ilara's honor, but he had ruthlessly defended his authority and, by extension, her position as his chosen instrument. Later that day, he found her staring out a window overlooking the palace's inner courtyard, her posture rigid with the lingering sting of the council's scorn. The air between them was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. He did not offer comfort or apology, for that would be an admission of a weakness he could not afford. "Their words are arrows," he stated, his voice cool and pragmatic as he came to stand beside her, though not too close. "You cannot stop them from being fired, but you can learn to wear armor." It was not the gentle reassurance she might have once dreamed of, but it was a form of guidance, a harsh lesson in survival from a man who had mastered it. He was teaching her how to live in this viper's nest he had thrown her into, an acknowledgement that her survival now mattered to him beyond its political expediency. Her only respite was Lyron. The small elven boy, free from the court's ingrained prejudice, had grown fiercely attached to the human who had sung him a lullaby in an alley. He would seek her out in the gardens, his small hand confidently taking hers, showing her his favorite flowers or the secret nooks among the ancient trees. One afternoon they were laughing, a pure, uncomplicated sound, as Lyron tried to teach her a simple elven weaving game with blades of grass. From his study window high above, Theron watched them. He saw the genuine smile that transformed Ilara's face, the easy affection between her and his son. A complex, unfamiliar emotion twisted in his chest. It was a sharp, possessive pang, not of a king watching his heir, but of a man watching the woman he had bound to himself share a moment of joy that had nothing to do with him. The court's animosity reached its peak during the Starlight Festival, a grand ball held in the main throne room. Ilara, dressed in shimmering silver silks, felt like a fraud. Trying to navigate the intricate web of elven etiquette, she inadvertently offered a formal greeting meant for a peer to Lord Valerius's wife, a noble woman of higher standing. The woman's gasp of feigned offense was theatrical, and a wave of quiet, cutting laughter rippled through the surrounding nobles. They turned their backs on her, their whispers of uncultured, human, and common loud enough to carry. The public humiliation was swift and absolute, leaving her standing alone in a sea of shimmering silks and cold smiles, more invisible and isolated than she had ever been in the grimiest tavern. The music swelled, cruelly highlighting her sudden, stark solitude. Theron had seen it all from his throne. The laughter of his court was a discordant note that grated on his soul. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, his fury a contained, Arctic storm. Then he rose. The music faltered and died as he descended the dais, his every step a silent, deliberate thunderclap that drew all eyes. He walked not to the nobles who had insulted her, but directly to Ilara. He stopped before her, the entire court holding its breath, and held out his hand. When she hesitantly placed hers in his grip was firm, possessive, and unapologetically public. He lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture of profound deference and ownership. Then, turning his glacial gaze upon the silent room, his voice rang out, low and deadly. "Let it be known," he declared, "that any insult directed at my queen is an act of treason against the crown. It will be punished as such. The silence that followed his declaration was absolute, a void of pure, collective shock. He led her back to the dais, his hand a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but back in the cold solitude of their adjoining chambers, the tension that had been simmering between them finally ignited. The air crackled, thick with the unspoken. He had not just defended a political asset, he had defended her. He had shielded her with his own power, publicly claiming her in a way that had nothing to do with their contract. Ilara stared at him, seeing for the first time the fierce, protective man beneath the layers of ice and duty. He, in turn, was grappling with the raw, unfamiliar instinct that had driven him, an act of pure emotion that had jeopardized his carefully laid plans. The question hung between them, terrifying and undeniable. How much of this was still an act? He took a step toward her, breaking the spell of silence. The vast chamber seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to the charged space between them. He raised a hand, his movements slow, hesitant, as if fighting an invisible current. His fingers, cool and impossibly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was a spark on dry tinder, a jolt of lightning that arced through her entire body, leaving her breathless. It was a gesture of such profound, unguarded tenderness that it shattered the last of her defenses. She saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in his eyes, a longing that mirrored the one blooming in her own chest. He snatched his hand back as if burned, turning away abruptly, the mask of the cold king slamming back into place. But it was too late. The line had been crossed. That night, sleep offered no escape. Ilara lay in the cavernous bed, the silk sheets a cold comfort against her skin. She replayed the moment in the throne room over and over, the weight of his hand in hers, the possessive fire in his eyes, the way he had stood between her and the contempt of his entire world. This was not the act of a monarch protecting his strategic investment. It was something deeper, something primal. A terrifying realization dawned in the quiet darkness of her mind. She, the invisible tavern girl, the creature of dirt and debt, was falling in love with the formidable, impossible elven king. The emotion was not a fantasy, it was a real, aching, perilous truth. Her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, had betrayed her, and in doing so had placed them both in more danger than any political rival ever could. A sharp, urgent knock on Theron's private study door shattered the pre-dawn stillness. It was his chief advisor, his face etched with grim purpose. He bowed low before delivering the news that Lord Valerius and his faction had not been cowed. They had been emboldened. They were now formally petitioning the council, using the king's uncharacteristic and emotional display at the festival as evidence of his compromised judgment. They claimed his attachment to the human was a weakness that endangered the realm. Their demand was a political masterstroke, a trap from which there was no easy escape. They insisted that, to prove the prophecy's legitimacy and secure the future of Silverwood, the royal marriage must be consummated immediately. The union had to produce a true heir, a child of both fading silver and vibrant earth. Their fragile, budding connection was no longer a secret to be nurtured, but a public duty to be performed. The news of the council's ultimatum fell like a sheet of ice between them, instantly freezing the fragile warmth that had begun to bloom. Theron retreated behind a wall of regal silence, his face once again carved from glacial stone, his eyes distant and cold. He moved through the palace like a ghost, the weight of his crown a visible burden, and the space he left around Ilara was a chasm of unspoken fury and political calculation. She felt the shift not as a gentle cooling, but as a violent, soul-crushing frost. The man who had defended her, who had touched her cheek with such startling tenderness, was gone, replaced by the formidable, unapproachable monarch she had first met. The silence was a weapon, and every passing, wordless moment was a fresh wound. reminding her that whatever had been growing between them was secondary to the survival of his kingdom, a fragile sprout trampled under the boot of duty. Unable to bear the suffocating quiet any longer, Ilara cornered him in the cold expanse of his private study, the starlight from the enchanted ceiling casting long, lonely shadows across the marble floor. "Talk to me," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper against the oppressive silence. "What did they say? What did they demand of you?" He refused to meet her gaze, his attention fixed on a star chart, as if the fate of constellations were more pressing than the turmoil in her eyes. "It is a matter of state." "Ilara," he replied, his tone dismissive, a cruel echo of the court's condescension. "It does not concern you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, a confirmation of her deepest fear. "It doesn't concern me," she shot back, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and rage. "Am I not the foreign remedy they whisper about? Am I not the pawn in this game? Do not dare make me invisible again." Her accusation shattered his composure. He turned from the chart, his eyes a raging winter storm, and the truth spilled from him, stark and brutal. He told her everything. He explained Valerius's political trap, the demand not just for an heir, but for the immediate, publicly acknowledged consummation of their marriage as proof of the prophecy's power and his own commitment. He laid the words bare, stripping them of any political euphemism. They were being commanded to perform the most intimate of acts as a public spectacle, a strategic move to appease his enemies and quell a brewing rebellion. The prophecy was no longer a whisper of hope. It was a shackle, and the council had just handed Valerius the key. He spoke not as a husband, but as a general, outlining the terms of his own surrender. And the cold, tactical nature of his explanation was the cruelest part of all. The revelation hollowed Ilara out, leaving a vast, echoing emptiness where her burgeoning hope had been. The tender moments, the shared glances, the protective fire in his eyes, all of it was now tainted, recontextualized as a prelude to this hideous, mandated performance. To be commanded to lie with him, to have their bodies used as a political statement, was a violation far deeper than any physical threat. It was a desecration of the one thing that was becoming real and sacred in her desolate life. "So that's all I am," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "A vessel to carry your heir, a duty to be performed. You brought me here, promising to free me from one master, only to become another, colder one. The dream of being seen had twisted into a nightmare of being used in the most profound way imaginable, her heart and body becoming the battlefield for his kingdom's civil war. Seeing the utter devastation in her eyes, the complete shattering of her spirit, broke through the last of his defenses. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands gripping her shoulders not with command, but with a desperate, trembling urgency. "No," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its regal authority. "That is what they demand. It is not what I want." He looked at her, his soul bared in his gaze, 1,000 years of solitude and despair cracking his composure. "Listen to me, Ilara. If I ever come to your bed, if I ever touch you as a husband, it will not be because my counsel decreed it. It will not be to fulfill some thrice-damned prophecy. It will be because the thought of living another day in this dying world without doing so has become more than I can bear." It was everything she had longed to hear, a confession of desperate, consuming desire. Yet it was poisoned by the circumstances, a beautiful truth spoken in the heart of an impossible lie. Before she could process his staggering admission, before she could find her voice in the emotional wreckage, he stepped back, the king's mask of resolve sliding partially back into place. His expression was grim, his decision made. "I have summoned the entire court to the throne room," he stated, his voice now low and steady, a harbinger of the coming storm. "Lord Valerius wants an answer. He will have it. He offered no further explanation, no hint of his strategy, leaving her suspended in a state of pure, agonizing terror. An hour later, she stood beside the empty throne, a silver-clad sacrifice, watching the sea of hostile elven faces. The great doors swung open, and Theron entered, his stride purposeful, his face an unreadable slate of cold fury. He mounted the dais, his gaze sweeping over the silent, expectant court, and took a breath to speak, the fate of two worlds resting on the words he was about to utter. Theron's voice, when it came, was not the roar of a king, but the low, somber tone of a man delivering a eulogy. He did not address Lord Valerius or the council, but the entire silent assembly. He spoke of the fading, not as a political problem, but as a grief that had hollowed out their souls for a century. He acknowledged their fear, their desperation, the cold dread that came with watching their world turn to ash. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, found Ilara's across the vast marble floor. In them, she saw none of the cold calculation she had feared, but the raw agony of a leader who had run out of strategies. He was stripping himself of his crown before their very eyes, laying his failure bare for all to see. He was no longer just their king, he was the embodiment of their collective sorrow, and the tension in the room shifted from accusation to a shared, profound despair. Then, with a resolve that seemed forged in the heart of a star, he turned his full attention to the council. "You demand I prove the prophecy," he stated, his voice ringing with a new, dangerous authority. "You demand I use my queen as a vessel to secure our future." He took a step down from the dais, his gaze sweeping over the nobles who had challenged him. "The prophecy is not a political tool to be wielded, nor is my wife a brood mare to be commanded. I brought her here as a symbol, a desperate gamble based on ancient words. I saw her as a means to an end, a foreign remedy for our ancient sickness." He paused, his gaze finding Ilara again, a silent confession passing between them that was for her alone, yet witnessed by all. "I was wrong. I was a fool, blinded by a king's duty, deaf to the truth that stood before me." His voice dropped, becoming intimate, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. This woman," he declared, his hand gesturing not to a queen but to Ilara, "has shown more courage in this nest of vipers than any of you have shown in a lifetime of hollow tradition. Her compassion is a fire in the heart of our winter. Her spirit is the vibrant earth our fading silver has so desperately needed." He walked towards her, his every step an abdication of his old self. "I did not fall in love with a prophecy. I fell in love with her." The words, spoken with raw, unshielded honesty, shattered the political theatre. Her heart, freely given, is the only magic that can save us, not a forced union, not a political heir. Her, only her. That is the truth I offer you in place of your demands." A gasp rippled through the court. Valerius sneered, opening his mouth to decry this as the final proof of a king lost to emotion. But no words came. A soft, emerald light began to pulse from the living wood of the chamber's walls, a warm, gentle thrum that resonated in their very bones. The ancient magic of the land, dormant for so long, was stirring, responding not to a ritual or a decree, but to the raw power of Theron's confession. He stopped before Ilara, ignoring the miracle unfolding around them, and sank to one knee. He took her hand, his eyes filled with 1,000 years of solitude, finally coming to an end. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I ask you not as your king, but as the man who loves you more than his own life. Will you be my wife, my true queen, by your choice, and yours alone?" Tears streamed freely down Ilara's face, washing away the last traces of the invisible tavern girl. She looked at the kneeling king, the impossible man who had seen her when no one else had, and her heart overflowed with a love so fierce it felt like it could remake the world. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a vow more powerful than any ancient binding rite. As she spoke, the emerald light flared, bathing the entire throne room in the vibrant, life-giving glow of a forest in spring. She pulled him to his feet, and before the stunned court, she initiated a kiss that was not a seal on a contract, but a collision of souls. It was a kiss of fire and ice, of earth and silver, a perfect, impossible union that sent a wave of healing magic pulsing through the very foundations of the palace. The prophecy was fulfilled not by a command, but by a surrender. 1 year later, sunlight, warm and brilliant, streamed through the high windows of the throne room, illuminating a court vibrant with renewed life. Theron stood with Elara on a balcony overlooking the Silverwood, now a sea of lush, impossible green. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, her head resting contentedly on his shoulder as she placed a hand over her gently swelling abdomen, a silent testament to their love and the kingdom's future. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a peaceful haven, a shared language of the soul. They were not a king and his consort, but two halves of a whole, fading silver and vibrant earth, forever intertwined. Their love had not just healed a dying land, it had forged a new world from the ashes of the old. If their journey from the shadows to the light has touched your heart, please honor it with a like, a comment, and by subscribing, so that more stories of hope can find their way to you.